Clear the air with Kia.
I used to white-knuckle my way through 101 traffic in a gas guzzler. Now I just set the smart cruise control, let the regenerative braking do its thing, and watch my Kia EV charge down the hills. The augmented reality heads-up display tech is insane. Navigation just floats on the windshield in front of me. It's like I'm driving in the future.
From intelligent driving features to a smoother, smarter ride, Kia EVs and hybrids bring innovation to every mile. And here in the Bay, that makes all the difference. Find your calm at kia.com. Kia, movement that inspires.
Hey everybody, this is Phil Donlin, movie star. You might know me from my screen debut, 1979's CBS TV movie of the week, Death Car on the Freeway, starring Peter Graves, Dinah Shore, and my good buddy, George Hamilton. You know, it's funny, we were on set. He said to me, you know, you're about as handsome as Charles Durning. Anywho, you're listening to my favorite thing that flies through the airwaves, Inspirado, Projecto.
Thank you so much, Phil Donlin, for opening up this show. Phil Donlin is an old friend of mine from high school. We were in our first play together. He is most recently seen as Lieutenant Stephen Vale in Chicago Fire, doing a great job there. He's in Power Book 4, Force, High and Outside, A Baseball Noir, and a bunch of other programs. Now, to get into this episode here, this is part 2 about ham radio. Part 1 is out. I'll put that link in the description. This is a conversation with my buddy Vince. I want to clarify a few things that he wanted me to correct for you here, that he got wrong in the last thing. Here are some corrections to the acronyms. GMRS and FRS are the names. General Mobile Radio Service and Family Radio Service. Aircraft tracking for aircraft equipped with ADS-B, Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast. Transmit their location and other data on the 1090 MHz frequency using a Mode S transponder. As for pirate broadcasting, moving around is a way to avoid for a longer time to be located. So, having said that, let's jump right back into this episode, and we shall see what more surprises await us. Thank you so much for listening to Inspirado Projecto.
And other people, you know, that's why they carry around a bunch of crystals. And essentially, radios today have a bunch of that capability of dynamically transmitting at different frequencies, utilizing, you know, special electronics and stuff, so that you can dynamically change your frequency so you don't stomp on people on different frequencies. And, you know, you're not supposed to transmit on emergency services, and you're not supposed to be transmitting on TV frequencies. So you're not supposed, or really without a license, of course, should not be transmitting on a VHF station with too much power, because then you'll be interfering with the TV station's commercial license usage that they have allocated to them. So that's how they you know, the rules and the innovation kind of go hand in hand, so that people can develop and not be frustrated with that desire to advance the industry and the hobby forward rather rapidly.
So you said something earlier about bringing crystals with you. Can you explain that? How are crystals used?
So crystals vibrate at a certain frequency. So when you look at a computer, you know, inside, you know, and they say, oh, this computer runs at 144 megahertz, or this runs at a gigahertz, or this runs at 3 gigahertz. There are crystals inside. You know, essentially they look like little metal oblong cans, right? And they pulsate at a certain frequency, just like, you know, quartz does for a watch, right? So when you put electricity into it, that the frequency, or the crystal will oscillate at a frequency.
So you're talking about a real crystal, like a crystal from the Earth's crystal? The crystal that we always hear that they hold vibrations, and the crystals that people make fun of and say, that doesn't hold a vibration. So we're talking about the same kind of crystals here, right?
Right. I mean,
this is fascinating.
Right. So, so essentially when you have, microelectronics, right? So electronics in general has, resistors and transistors and capacitors and inductors and all sorts of stuff, right? And crystals is being one of those. So, so when you have crystals for RF stuff, you remember they had crystal radios, right? Crystal radios, literally they're oscillators, right? So a particular crystal that you can buy is for either timing purposes. So a computer uses a crystal for timing so that, it's basically a synchronous process going on so that you can coordinate bus activity and memory fetching and instruction caching and instruction fetching and all of that, right? So everything's got to be regulated, for the entire computer to be able to function properly. If you have the address and the data bus basically sharing at the same time, it'll stomp all over each other and the computer won't work because it won't know, is that data or is that an address or is that an instruction? What is that? Right? So basically, as these things are flying around inside the computer, there has to be a pulsating, a frequency in which they all can run at. Okay. Whoa. And it's also, there are limitations also about, the speed of certain things. So, and an old IBM PC, XT, and AT and stuff, you couldn't have things going more than, say, 12 megahertz on the bus because it would crash. It was too fast. But, so they're multipliers essentially. So you can have a 12 megahertz 12 megahertz crystal, but then you can scale it down, say to, 6 megahertz and 8 megahertz and stuff like that. So as you basically can increase or decrease the multiplication factor of the crystal, you can basically have a 2 megahertz or 4 megahertz machine, okay, being run by a 12 megahertz crystal and just basically changing, what the processor sees. So it's going to run at 4 megahertz. But the bus can run faster because it's not bound by that same multiplier. So same thing with frequencies for remote control cars and things like that. As I said, if you take a look at back in the day with Radio Shack, they had those particular cars that you would get your kids or whatever, or you as a kid would have in order to play with your remote control car. So on those particular ones, again, they would have essentially, the different crystals, but they were built in. Okay, so that frequency that it was transmitting and receiving on essentially was a 28 megahertz. And another one was at 48 megahertz or whatever.
So wait, that's dependent on which kind of crystal is in there? So if I put it, because it's been said that the selenite crystal is the highest vibrating one. That and also rose quartz. If you put that in there at its highest vibration, does the radio have to be configured to that crystal, or can you kind of put any crystal in there that you want?
Oh no! So a lot of these like transmitters, you've seen them with the little joysticks and stuff, right? You can put a whole bunch of different crystals in it, not at the same time, but 27, like an AM, say, 27.175. So the transmit and receive crystals. You put the transmitter in your transmitter, the one with the little joysticks, and you put the receiver in the car or the airplane. Okay, so. And again, each of these particular types of, those were, say, the 27 or AM crystals. So when you do that, when you have those particular crystals in there, only one car can run on that frequency. So if you and I both have the same frequency crystal, then my transmitter can control your car.
Oh yeah,
right?
Yes.
And you've seen that, I'm sure, when you were a kid.
Yes.
You're like,
yeah, me and my brother. We'd have to change the channel or whatever, so we weren't, because I was accidentally. I remember I was piloting his car. So you're telling me each of those have a different. I mean, there's an actual crystal inside of these things? Are they just tiny or what?
Well, again, they look like a little metal can, like essentially like an oblong, rectangular but curved, like a rounded metal deal, and you just they plug those in. Now, some of them look a little different, like they might be. You've seen them, I'm sure. They have like 2 pegs on the bottom of it. They may be a half inch or a quarter inch tall.
Yeah.
And you just plug them in, and some of them actually have multiple crystals in it, so that you could just have a little switch on the bottom, so you go like I don't have.
Oh my gosh!
Right. So
this whole time I had no idea it's fantasy and sci-fi tied into one. I mean, if anyone just said out loud, "Oh yeah, radios are powered by crystals," "Oh yeah, cars are powered by crystals," people would be like, "What are you talking about? That's ridiculous." Or people healing with crystals, they're like, "Oh, that's ridiculous." But here we have evidence that actually crystals do hold a vibration, do hold a frequency, and are enabling this kind of communication. I mean, this is blowing my mind right here.
Well, they produce it. They produce the vibration because just like the piezoelectric effect. When you put essentially electricity into a piezoelectric crystal or device, okay, it'll basically vibrate, make a sound, right? So you've heard of piezoelectric buzzers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you could basically just put certain voltages and stuff onto it, and it will make certain frequencies. And there's other more complicated aspects of it, but you put electricity into it, and it makes a noise. But if you basically vibrate the piezoelectric buzzer, it'll actually produce electricity. Okay, very much like a motor. Okay, can be not only a motor that produces electricity. You can put electricity into a motor and it spins, right? If you spin a motor by hand, it produces electricity. That's pretty much how like a water wheel or like a dam works. You've got essentially these large, motors, okay, turbines that are sitting there being spun by water, falling over them, right? When you do that, you essentially are generating electricity and you're putting it out the wires. You could do it the opposite way, where you could put energy into the wires and then turn the motor and then essentially move stuff with it, okay, like a saw, right? So a saw is the opposite. You plug it into a wall, it gets electricity, it shoots it into the motor, it spins the blade, spins the motor, right?
Good evening. This is Frank Edward Nora from the rambling audio universe of OnSug Radio, the Overnightscape Underground, and you're listening to Inspirado Projecto.
Here's your fun fact. Cats are the sleepiest of all mammals. They spend 16 hours of each day sleeping. With that in mind, a 7-year-old cat has only been awake for 2 years of its life. Stay tuned to Inspirado Projecto for more fun facts.
The other aspect is essentially a water wheel or a turbine on a waterfall, and it spins the turbine, spins the motor, and it produces electricity. So it's the same sort of thing. Crystals vibrate and are vibrated. Okay, so when you have those resonances and stuff happen, you can send and receive. Okay, radio waves. When you transmit a radio wave, you're vibrating essentially the antenna essentially to produce frequencies, radio waves. When that radio wave hits another antenna, it vibrates the antenna at that frequency. Okay? So, you've probably done this experiment. When you get a tuning fork, one on one side of the room and another on another side of the room, and they're at different frequencies, so you have, one tuning fork at one frequency, another tuning fork at another. When you hit one tuning fork, the other one that's not at the same frequency does not have a resonating effect. It will not make a noise. But if you have two tuning forks at the same frequency, when you hit one on one side of the room, that vibration will happen, and it'll actually start to vibrate the tuning fork on the other side of the room that's of the same frequency. So you get a resonance. You can transmit essentially information from one tuning fork to the other.
Wow.
So that's with sound. That's just, audio frequency. Do the same thing with radio frequency. It's just an antenna. You vibrate essentially using crystals and frequencies. You're generating, it's all the aspect of electronics and physics where you have the period of the curve of the frequency. Like I say, the period of a curve, right? That curve, like a sine wave, has a period and a time, across and stuff. So when you have the period, and 1 over the period is the frequency, right? So the larger the frequency, the shorter the wave. So a higher pitched wave. Okay? So, that's why you have like microwaves are much higher frequency than say FM radio waves. Those are longer waves. So when you vibrate an antenna somewhere, anything that's tuned to it that has the same essentially characteristics like a tuning fork will vibrate the antenna somewhere else. And that vibration is basically transmitted into the receiver, right? So you have a transmitter and you have a receiver. The transmitter vibrates the antenna, sends it outwards. The receiver picks up the vibrations and then translates that into sound. So it's very much, you ever see the people that talk by laser beam? Have you ever seen that little experiment?
I don't think I've seen that one yet.
Okay, it's very, very, very straightforward and simple. You get a laser pointer, okay? Just like a normal $5 laser pointer. And you essentially can hook a microphone up to it with a little circuit. And when you talk on the microphone, it'll make the laser beam flash on and off very, very rapidly. You won't even really notice it, like by eye, because it's too fast, right? So you are encoding the audio into essentially changing the frequency or the pulsating of the laser beam. Well, if you put that laser beam and you point it at a solar cell, and on the solar cell you then connect it to a speaker, you can essentially shoot that laser however many miles that laser will go, and as long as you hit that solar panel, a little solar cell, it'll basically be able to, you can talk over light. Okay?
This is incredible. I cannot believe we're not mining this information so much more. I mean, you've just exploded my brain, the fact that all these things are powered with crystals, and now you're talking about talking through lasers. Oh my gosh. It's nuts, dude.
Well, the thing that's very interesting about all of this is that, there are people, they wonder why, say, ham radio is not as popular, say, as we would hope it to be. You know what I mean? Now, why is that? Well, I can be honest with you. The problems I have with ham radio, it's got nothing to do with ham radio itself. Amateur radio is awesome. But when you go and try to get your license, you basically want to do a lot of research, right? You can get some books, you can get some apps, there's all sorts of things. Wonderful resources around. But all of the books and things most people get, not all of them, but most people, they get the testing book, okay? Because when you get your, say, technician's license, you go for the test, there's a set of questions in the element for technician. I think it's 10 times as many questions that they have in an element. It's essentially a database of questions that they have on the test. So there's 35 questions on the test. There have to be at least 350 questions in the data bank. If you memorize all those questions or all those types of questions in the data bank, right? If you have a good memory, you can pretty much very easily go and get the exam, because you only have to get, I don't remember, 25 or 27 questions correctly or something like that, the best for like a technician. Now, I'm not saying that everything in the database is exactly what you're going to see on a test. They'll change the numbers of like, what's the frequency if your period is this or blah, blah, blah. Well, you have to know the kind of the formula, but it's the same type of question. So, one question may use a certain set of numbers and another question may use another set. Just like when you take a standardized test, Regents or whatever in school, they're forms of questions. So, and some of them are just flat out the same. Like what is the regulation that does such and such, or what is the rule about such and such? Well, it's the same question. It's in the element. So as long as people go through and they understand a little bit of the theory and they understand, what questions there are going to be asked, they can pass their test. But there's much more to amateur radio than that. There's the operations. There's the lingo. There's the courtesy. There's the operational, responsibilities. What do you do with a radio? How do you program a radio? What are frequencies? What frequencies do I transmit at? I mean, a lot of that stuff is just not on the test. It's more of like it's kind of like the difference between the written driver's test and the actual, behind the wheel test.
Oh.
Right? A lot of people, they pass their written test, but the behind the wheel kind of thing of ham radio, it's like, I guess I'll just kind of bumble through. And, you can watch some videos on YouTube and, again, you could practice, that's why a lot of people, they're kind of scared to transmit because they don't want to look like an idiot, or they don't want to sound like, or they don't want to be like people to abuse them. Like, get off, you noob. You don't know what the hell you're doing. Get off the radio. And you shouldn't ever do that. But, people fear that. And, that might give them a very bad experience. So my problems with ham radio, the hobby, okay, is, and why more people are not doing it, okay, is that it can get expensive, okay, and you need to have, say, to do it right, you need to have an antenna and stuff like that. So as a kid, just like most other things, you don't have any money. So the only thing that you can do is you can, hope that you get, either you work for the money, you get it as a present. You might get it as a present, but, your family might be like, I don't want to put that ugly antenna on my roof, whatever, right? Or maybe your HOA says, you can't have that. I don't know. It just really depends. Okay? So, so it really behooves the aspect that a library and schools and clubs and religious organizations or whatever, they need to provide support, right? A funded school program that teaches why ham radio is needed, why it's essential, why it's cool. Okay, there's a lot of amazing programs in Britain where a lot of grade school kids learn, and every one of them gets their license, kind of thing. So which is really cool, and that's what we really need to get the youth involved. But when you have a cell phone that's $50, right, you can get a decent Android phone for under $100 easily, even a tablet, right? And if you can essentially text and call and whatever, even if it's like $30 a month or whatever, and it's a $50 phone, what the hell? What do I care? I'm talking to my friends. I can group chat. I can go on the internet. What's the purpose of having a ham radio, right? So the incentive for learning something like ham radio is more of an educational value, as well as if you can get into some fun stuff like the fox hunting and, the ham festivals and stuff like that, right? You have to have people that are excited around you. And sometimes, I've run into this where there's some ham clubs that the people are so elitist. They really are. I mean, they shouldn't be, because that's not the way ham radio is supposed to be. But it's just like, oh my God, I don't want to talk to so-and-so because it's just like, they're just a blowhard or whatever. And there's a lot of old people, a lot of, old timers, there are what they call Elmers. Elmers are the guys that teach, and they love the radio and stuff. And they're great. You want to have a mentor, right? But a lot of them are really old, like 70, kind of thing. And because, the age group above 40 is kind of where it's at. Anything below 40, it's very thin until you get down to like grade school level, because that's where you might have it taught in school or at a club, right? An incentive helpful for recruitment, you got to have, sponsored or accepted accreditation for schools and scouts and stuff like that. That'd be a good, incentive, so Boy Scouts have a ham radio, badge, and their little, I don't know, they call it a flyer or like an insert or whatever, but it's like 75 pages long. So they go through all sorts of wonderful explanations about how to use your radio, what are the parts of the radio, what each of the part of the radio, what's the transmitter, what's the receiver, what's an antenna, what's the microphone, what's the speaker, what is a code key for Morse code, like what are all these things and blah blah blah, right? So what are crystals? What's all of these aspects of how the radio works and what the parts of the radio are and stuff like that. It's online, it's free. You can just download the PDF and go through it. So it's wonderful. We need more like that, but for school, not just for scouts and any sort of group, social group that, and again, if you go to meetup.com, I haven't gone actually myself, I really should, because there are probably some ham clubs that are more social, if you will, than, technical. You know what I mean? They want to be involved with people, not just with equipment, because you always imagine a ham radio operator as being locked in his room or locked in his shack over a bunch of glowing tubes and, with 17 radios or more, stacks of electronic equipment around him, and he's got a microphone in front of him and maybe a Morse code key. And, it's a typical, I find it in some way, maybe the word's wrong, but romantic, there's an aspect of it that's very appealing. It's like, oh,
yeah,
this is amazing. This is there's a certain sort of desire to be the mad scientist of radio and stuff like that.
What is tricky, like you're saying that, it costs so much to keep it up. What? Because does it cost so much to keep it up because you're paying fees and fees every year, or where's the big expense in addition to just buying the equipment?
Okay, well, so the fee for licenses is like, I think the license is good for 10 years, in which, there's a window, I think even after your license expires, you have 2 years to renew it without having to take a test or anything like that, right? As long as you renew it within that grace period, you don't have to retake the test. If you're outside that, you have to retake the test. But if you do, you just pay another $35 or whatever it is, I think, and that's it. I mean, so that's not expensive. Like surely you can afford $35 every 10 years, right? I mean, I would hope. And the other thing is that maybe you can get someone to sponsor you, right? It's kind of like doing some sort of, you go to a ham fest or you go to do a crop walk or something. You can have people sponsor you and you do something and you get $35. Now, I do believe that the ARRL, which is the Amateur Radio Relay League, I think they might even have like sponsorships where if you don't have the money, you could apply and they'll pay for it for you, But it is the radio, it's the equipment, in particular the radio, but the antenna, and the poles and the wires and all that other stuff, right? So that can get expensive. Radios can be $1,000. They can be more than that. Some are, $100 to $500 for a good radio, but others are much, much more expensive. The more expensive the radio, the more features and things it has. But you can get, as I said, a handheld radio for $35. You just go on Amazon and they're reasonable. I mean, they're good radios. If you're in the country, it might not be good. Like it might not be strong enough. You might definitely have to hook up your handheld to a tall antenna, right? Because the people that are using it might be further away. Or maybe in the country, a lot of people use it. Because when I was growing up in the country and we had CB radio, like almost every one of my friends had a CB radio.
I imagine that must have been so much fun having the CB radios. It's almost like, hey, we got our own kind of radio station, so to speak.
Yeah, well, it's funny because there are a few different types. There's the base station, in your house, and you've got a little corner of your house or the garage or whatever set up with your radio rig and, all your electronic equipment like your oscilloscope, because, you're doing your theory, your antenna theory and your radio theory and you're building circuits and you're making your own amplifiers and all of that, right? And you might experiment with tubes and you might experiment with, transistors and solid state electronics. You can, do all that sort of stuff. So there's, a lot of stuff that you might do. Then there's the mobile rig. The mobile rig was the one that you had in your car, whether it was permanent or you could take it out and put it back in. And you had your antenna either mounted on permanently or magnetically on your roof, or maybe you had a whip antenna that was on your bumper, kind of thing. And, you could drive around, and so anywhere you were, you could be talking on a CB radio, just like a truck or whatever, right? We had them in our cars. And then, of course, you had the walkie-talkie, right? But most walkie-talkies as kids, they were so low-powered, and they were stuck on channel 14, and, you could talk maybe in the neighborhood with it, but, we would rather be riding a bike and chew the rag, somewhere, so, maybe though you see it in the movies where, like you call from your room to your buddy's room, and you guys are talking, just like cell phones today or whatever, right? Instead of talking on the phone, you could use your walkie-talkie, and you normally see in the movies, like, usually the radios, the walkie-talkies kids have are like the surplus army ones, they're gigantic, not the backpack one, but, it's got like a 7-foot antenna or something ridiculous. But, that was the whole point. There's that sort of cool aspect, that romantic aspect of, like being able to talk to your buddies, or, you can call your friends in the neighborhood all together, that sort of thing. Because, back then, for me, we didn't have cell phones. We had phones, and like my best friend, he was only like 2-3 miles away as the crow flies, but he was in a different area code. So I could literally drive to his house for cheaper than to talk to him for a few minutes on the phone, because it was like $1 or something a minute on the phone, He was in a different time, like a different area code. I was like, holy shit. And one of his neighbors, they literally were like, he was in one house, his neighbor was maybe 1,000 feet away, like through the woods, and, his buddy's house was there, and they were in opposite, area codes as well. So they ran a wire from one house to the other, and they just had these like bat phones, so they pick up one phone and it would buzz on the other, and so they could actually talk on their phones, like a special phone between houses, because, like calling on a phone line was really expensive. So, that's why in certain communities, radio was actually back then was kind of a cool thing, because, you didn't have to pay anybody for it. It was free. It was open. People can listen and eavesdrop on your conversations, but in general, even though you're not supposed to speak in code, people do. They make references, and you're like, I don't know what the hell they're talking about.
Wait, is that one of the things that you learn when you're taking the class or whatever, that you're not allowed to talk in code?
You're not supposed to be talking in encrypted or coded type ways and all that. It's just frowned upon, if you will, and it's also like a regulation. But again, the FCC, especially like nowadays in the climate that it is now, FCC is not fucking driving around. They don't have any people to do that, right? You might be reported to the FCC, and they might dispatch someone from the FCC, but you got to have someone rat on you, before something like that happens, right? No one's going to be. It's not like in England where they drove around and was trying to figure out if you were watching TV to pay the TV tax, right? They would do that. You turn on a TV and you didn't have your license or whatever to watch TV, and you'd sure as hell have someone knocking at your door, and they would be handing out a fine, right? But the FCC's got better things to do than that. Okay, but they do take things seriously. So if someone reports you for abusing something, then yeah, right. So you've been informed is essentially what they'll say. And you might have to pay a fine. I don't know what the infractions are. The thing is that they do tell you there are regulations. You do read the regulations. You understand the regulations. You should, because you took the test, and use at your own risk. If you decide to break the rules, then you can pay the consequences for that. But again, the cool thing is that, when you have people, a community around you, or you have a community that needs something like the ARES project, which is, the emergency services, organization, right? Where you are, in the event of some sort of natural disaster, you're there to help your community through that disastrous, right? So, the thing is that, you have to be very careful, about certain things, but you want to have outreach programs. Maybe you could have like a grandparent-grandchild type of thing where, like grandkids and can talk to their grandparents, via ham radio, right? But you got to be careful, and be knowledgeable so that unscrupulous characters don't try to take care of, elderly or kids or whatever, right?
Step into tomorrow with NeuroNova by Psycorp. This isn't just a drug, it's a revolution. Unlock hidden creativity, boost your focus to laser precision, or even dream in vivid, controllable worlds. NeuroNova rewires what's possible with effects so wild, they'll surprise you. Safe, cutting edge, and available now, NeuroNova helps you transcend the ordinary.
It's Superhero, and you're listening to Inspirado Projecto.
Parents and youth leaders and teachers and youth pastors and scoutmasters, they need to be recruited so that they in turn can assist people in training, right? So if you've got your parents involved and youth leaders and stuff like that, everyone gets licensed and everyone's excited. You're building a community together. That's an important aspect. It's kind of like when you have a core curriculum for school, right? If everyone's books are electronic and they're on, say, like a Kindle, right? So you buy a Kindle for $50 or something, and every one of your textbooks and all your assignments and all that is on that electronic book. Right? So you have 20 textbooks and all whatever on your Kindle. Well, it's great for a kid, right? And maybe the fact is that you might have a Kindle at home and you might have a Kindle at school, so that you don't have to bring it back and forth. So your fifth grader doesn't get mugged on a bus and they take break his book, right? His Kindle. But everyone has the ability to always be able to have curriculum available to them. But once you do that, once you enable kids to have the curriculum in school and at home, and it's free, you also are now enabling the parents who may not have education. They might be immigrants or whatever, right? So they're not very, or even they're older, like, oh my God, the new math, I don't know what the new math is about, or I don't remember that science, or that science wasn't even, we were made of dirt and dust. There's no DNA. My father would always say that. He's like, we didn't DNA. That was in the 50s,
Yeah.
We were, as far as we were concerned, we were dust and dirt, just like they said in the Bible. That's what we were made of, So, of course, he was more scientific, so he always was like about biology and stuff, but, they didn't know. Again, we're talking about germs and viruses and bacteria and stuff like that, that was all, nuclear stuff when you're talking about Einstein. All of those things were coming to play, but if you didn't have that education, or you couldn't afford the education, or, you just didn't have the opportunity to have it, you didn't have it. So maybe your kids, if you had the mentality of you want your kids to have it better than you would essentially do everything you could to educate your kid or have them educated. But if you have those books available at home, the parents can also, essentially, they could be helping their kids. They could be helping themselves. They might be like, I don't really know how to read that well. I don't really know how to do some basic math. I don't, adding fractions and multiplying. I don't really know how to do that. But I just look at my kids' books or the curriculum online, and maybe they pick up a little bit more. Maybe the kids can show them, say, oh, this is what I learned at school today. And that particular symbiotic relationship, is the same, that sort of thing that could become with ham radio. Once a subject or something and you share it with the community, you get to all benefit. That's why programming in the 70s, where England basically, that was their thing. They're like, we're going to educate every single student about programming and about computers. And they, the cottage industries exploded with programmers and using BASIC and stuff. So, and then people started getting the Sinclair and some people got the Commodore 64 and the VIC-20 and the TRS-80 and the Apple and stuff like that. So all of a sudden it was so new. And of course there were dozens of different types of computers. But the thing was that when you learned it in school, when you learn something in school all the way through school, as soon as you get out of school and into college and out of college, what are you gonna suggest at work? What you know. would you recommend an IBM? I don't know anything about IBM. I would go with an Apple.
Yes.
So, that's, again, same thing with like, Microsoft, Apple, and Cisco. They all had, education programs so that every single high school student I know in like, Arlington, Virginia, and a few other school districts in Virginia, they had, Cisco curriculum. So when the kids got out of school, some of them actually didn't even go to college. They knew they got jobs right out of high school because they had a whole bunch of certifications because they were taught in school, and companies would hire them, which is not a great thing. They should go to college, but the thing is that maybe they couldn't afford college, so they were able to work and have maybe even their job pay for college and stuff like that. So maybe they would, go either later or at the same time, or maybe they would go and have their community college, go to community college and have that paid for. So, but a lot of kids, they knew Cisco routers. So what were they going to recommend at work and work on at work? Cisco routers. That's you recommend what you know. So we need that sort of thing for ham radio, and it's basically not. It's about how to pass a test. That's what most ham radio type of experiences are. Is how do you pass a test? Because you got to pass that test to really play the game properly, right? In order to transmit, in order to speak on your radio, you have to have that test. You have to have that license. And if you don't have a community and you don't have fun to do it, it's laborious.
Yeah.
It's boring. Okay? Really, I mean, a lot of people are just like, I don't really know math, and I don't want, frequencies and periods and what the hell is is a transmitter? What's a crystal, right? Well, crystals are, it's like my first introduction to crystals were crystal radio, right? Where you can essentially listen to AM radio, essentially, or crystal radio, with basically a little crystal tuner and an earphone, right? That was, you could buy that for like $3 in the back of a comic book, right? And then in the 70s, they had the Timex, the Japanese came out with essentially, instead of the Swiss kind of operation where you have jewels, ruby pivots and stuff like that, and springs and gears, they had the electronic watch. So you pulsate, you send electronic pulse into a quartz crystal, and it vibrates essentially perfectly to give you a 60-second action, right? So the crystal controls the seconds, and the seconds then, all the gears and stuff will then do the minutes and the hours and stuff like that, right? So that was my introduction to crystals and that sort of thing. And as you said, people mock and say, oh, crystals, you're going to heal yourself. Well, as Tesla said, everything's about vibration.
It really is.
It really is. And honestly, another cool thing is that the vibration, what is vibration? Well, the vibration is the frequency. That vibration of your antenna produces the frequencies in order to carry the radio waves, TV, FM, AM, shortwave, single sidebands, full sideband, full band, air band, all of that stuff, right? All of the different types of transmissions that basically amateur radio uses. And so, again, it's about having a supportive environment that has great activities and educational material, so that you're not just learning it by memorization, you're not learning it just by rote. It's like learning the multiplication tables.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you just repeat it over and over. Or you can do some really fancy, cool little techniques with your hands, or a little. So we had a record that was the multiplication table stuff, and you learned it by song. Right? So different people learn different things, and that's the problem I see, with that. But there's also technology. One of the things that ham radio suffers from is that it kind of lags a little bit behind from the amateur radio side in advancements of stuff, right? So you have a cell phone. It's cheaper than a radio for the most part. Okay? You have a tablet. You have the internet. You have, Starlink. You have, satellite transmissions and stuff. You've got all of that. Okay? And it's a very, very reasonable or very cheap price point. Okay, and sometimes, you know, the price point of things is really what breaks, you know, an industry. Okay, so you know, that's one of the aspects of, you know, why certain technologies just died out, or certain competitors would die out, because it's like, why would I go and buy a slide rule, you know, when I can buy a calculator, and anyone can use a calculator.
Oh,
Using
yeah.
a slide rule takes, you know, technique, and it's also, you get some pretty expensive slide rules for the, you know, precision, and then I got to know logarithms and blah. It's like, oh my God, like, just fucking put it into a calculator, you know. And if you take a look at today with calculators, there's graphing calculators, there's programming calculators, there's, you know, algebraic symbolic calculators. I mean, it's like, oh my God, like, and they're $120, right? You know, I mean, it's a lot of money, but at the same time, they're computers, right? They're, you know, it's a very purposefully built, you know, technology, and, you know, people will actually learn in school how to use the calculator and not do the math.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Same thing
yeah.
with clocks too, right? They're used to the digital. They
Right,
have a hard
absolutely.
time looking at the circular one.
Right, the analog watch people are like, I don't know how to tell. I said, like, same thing with cursive, you know, like, I don't know how to read cursive,
Yeah.
you know, like,
Yeah.
you know, but anyway, the aspect is that, you know, when you have certain technologies that are so cheap and so available and stuff, people go with that. They're just like, you know, why would I do the harder thing? That's one of the reasons why they got rid of the Morse code requirement. If you want to use certain bands, you have to learn code. But if you don't, which most people don't want to use those bands, they don't really care. You know, the diehards might want to do it, but 99% of the people, they're just like, I just want to talk or listen on the radio. I don't want to, or talk anyway. I don't care about Morse code. So they just said, okay, you don't have to do Morse code anymore. And, you know, and, you know, it's so interesting. 5 words a minute, you know, is what you had to do in order to get your novice, you know.
Wow.
And 5 words a minute is like, you know, it's like 100 baud or something. It's like A, B, C. It's about how fast it is. Okay?
Yeah.
And just like driving is really freaking fast when you're starting out. But as you get better at it, it's on remote control. You know, you're on autopilot. You just hear patterns as well. It's like when you read, you know, when you first started reading, you read each letter and then you had to form the word, and then you would read the word. When you speed read, you don't read words. You don't even read necessarily, you know, the shapes of words. You do kind of, but you almost do like shapes of sentences. Some people will actually read both pages simultaneously, and their brain just puts it together. And a lot of people who speed read at like 5,000 to 10,000 words a minute, and my mom and my oldest brother can do that. And my mom in particular, she's like, I'm not reading. She goes, yes, I can read subvocularly, you know, where you talk to yourself kind of thing. She goes, but when I start speed reading, it literally is, she can like glance at the paper and then hand it back to you. And you're like, well, no, read it. And you're like, I did. And it's like, well, what did it say? And she could say everything, and not only that, she had comprehension.
Wow. That's incredible.
Oh yeah. But, you know, she could, when she read, she said it was almost like a movie. Right? She said she just like saw the pictures in her head, like all of a sudden the story just started unfolding itself in front of her, kind of thing. Again, it's hard to explain, or she said it was kind of hard to explain what it was, but you know, if you're going to explain it, was like it's not reading word for word or sentence for sentence. It was more like reading a page or 2 pages at the same time and flipping through the book, and you basically it was symbolic, if you will. You know, they were like, you know, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. So she would like see that sort of thing. And Morse code can be like that, where people, you know, they hear patterns. They don't hear each letter. You know, you hear a word, you know the pattern of a word, because you know, it's like driving. You could be driving completely by reflex, if you will, right? And only when something really serious happens where you have to like snap to attention, then you do. But in general, Morse code, when you get really good at it, at 20, 30, 40, 100 words a minute, right? You don't hear letters anymore. You just hear patterns of words and sentences even, or, and especially when you're talking to your buddy and you have particular patterns that you talk in, it's kind of like, you ever hear people doing the, auctions?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I saw a great thing where this daughter and father, they were, I don't remember what they call them, but, they're auctioneers. And as they were doing the auctions in different rooms, they would be talking to each other. Like they could hear each other in each of the rooms, right? So in between the 7, we have 7, we have 8, well, in all that babbling, they were literally talking to one another from room to room.
Amazing.
But no one understood it, but they basically practiced with one another where they could do that, right? Because, and again, Morse code and games and things like that are really necessary because, aspects like, I can text myself or text messages and I can send my location with ham radio. Big deal. I can do that on my cell phone. A 5-year-old can do that on a cell phone, right?
Yeah.
Text them, right? So why? Well, when you can build your own equipment and you can put it inside your robot and you can do whatever and you are in full control of it, that's what's exciting. Those are the technologies and those are the things and stuff. And again, being able to have a license to transmit on frequencies that no one else are supposed to, that's where one of the things is also people are like, oh, that's gold, But again, we have to approach ham radio, I believe, differently to recruit more people into the field. And I think that it needs to not be taught as how to pass the test.
Yeah.
But, how to use it and how to understand this. Like, I don't understand all this theory of antennas.
Mm-hmm.
Antenna theory is extremely complicated, but you don't have to know how electricity works to know how to turn on and off a light.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's true.
So you can teach people a lot of things, by just, immersing them in it and just showing them. Again, I don't believe that there's any sort of age limitation. If you could pass the test, you could pass the test. I think it's very much like an airline. Let me see, actually. I can look it up right now. Let's see. Age restriction.
Do they have? You think they have probably channels that are like kid friendly?
They all should be kid friendly.
Oh, that's good.
You're not really supposed to swear and things like that on the radio. So, but I'm not saying that people don't. I'm not saying that people don't, do awful things either. Again,
because I bet parents I'm just imagining parents would probably feel a lot more open to getting their kid, trying their kids out on the ham radio experience, and socializing, unquote, in that sense, if they knew that there was, it was pretty safe out there.
Well, you got to be careful. Be worried about exploitation, right? Now, like on a cell phone and stuff like that, there's encryption, there's anonymity, there's protections and stuff, right? As long as you follow that stuff and you're not giving out your phone number or where you live and all of that, right? There's social engineering aspects behind it too. But on ham radio, you got to be really careful because unless you protect your address is published for everyone in the world to see.
Oh, okay? That's right. Right? We're talking about that.
Yeah, and you could also triangulate people.
Oh, right? Yeah.
Right. So you want to make sure that, you have a safe environment, right? So from what I'm thinking is that something like HamSphere, I'm not I have a HamSphere. I've actually got a subscription. I've used it a few times just to play. It's nice. Okay. And it's all like digital, right? So you don't have necessarily those sort of worries okay, where, maybe people can do stuff or maybe try to trace your IP packets, I don't know. But the point being is that it's much more protected, say, than just ham radio, okay? So if you want to give people a ham radio-like experience like a kid, you can do it in a safer environment. Or, of course, if you do it with parents, you do it with older kids and stuff like that, right? So you don't want your 5-year-old talking at 12 o'clock at night on the radio.
Mm-hmm.
Alone. It's just not cool. It says there's no minimum age for licensing. Applications as young as 5 years old have passed the examinations and were granted licenses. So it's just like a pilot's license. You do not have an age restriction on pilot's license. You just have to be able to fly the airplane. Yeah, and you have to pass it, but you just have to. If you pass your flight exam, your written exam, and your flight, your solo, you can. There's no age restriction.
Well, Vince, that's a good note for us to end on. I notice we've got about pretty much 2 hours combined from the beginning and this right now of conversation. I'll chop this up into 2 episodes. And get started right on that. And I just want to thank you so much for being on Inspirado Projecto and providing this education and information and all these things that many people just don't, really know about or talk about. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I just think it's, phenomenal.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciated talking about it. I mean, again, I'm not an expert in any way. I might have said some things that were not quite right, but I leave it to your listeners to say, hey, and again, as far as I'm concerned, I'm just starting out because I'm gearing up to get my license, my technician's license, and then maybe even a general license. That way, there's 3 stages, and so I'd have 2 of them, and that would be, a great thing.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I love to delve right into it. I love to get the books. I love to go online. You know me. I like to do the research and all that. So, I recommend. It's a great and fun hobby. And again, though, you look for the community because doing it if you don't have a community, what are you going to do? Talk to yourself?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right? I mean,
that's
like what you're gonna put a radio in each one of your bedrooms, and you're gonna talk, and you go, "Oh, hang on a second." You run down the hallway, and you go into your bedroom, and you pick up the radio, and go, "Hey, how's it going?" And you run back into the living room. Of course, you have to have people, and that's and there are people who love to talk to strangers. Right? They love to, and again, it's also like a collecting thing. QSOs, Hey, I got Kurt's, QSO, his call signs, and I know where he is, and I put a little push pin, and I keep a log of thousands of people I've talked to, and they've reached out and had contact. It's like, some people go, so what? But other people I love doing that. I met people all over the world. And it's like, well, you talk to them, and that's cool.
That is so cool.
And that's the aspect of maybe also getting people to be much more comfortable, and even say talking on Inspirado Projecto. That's I haven't talked to you on Inspirado Projecto for quite a long time, and maybe we can make a few more of these.
I would love it. Well, thank you so much, Vince. You have a great day, and I'll let you know when the links are ready.
Sounds good.
Thank you. You take care. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Incredible. What an astounding amount of information from Vince, huh? If you didn't get a chance to check out part 1, there's more where that came from. I'll add that into the description so you can dive deeper in there. Also in the description, I'll add some great resources that Vince provided for me in case you're just starting out on your ham radio adventures, or if you've been adventuring through ham radio for a very long time. Maybe you could pass that information on to any of your friends or family who either appreciate ham radio and or want to get into it. So, I want to thank Phil Donlin, Hollywood actor, for his promo. Thank you, Frank Nora, host of Overnightscape Podcast. We got a great Overnightscape Podcast situation on a past episode of Inspirado Projecto. I will put those links into the description. Also, Henry D. Horse with a fun fact. Thank you so much for that fun fact about cats. I always love when you give us those. Also, from one of our sponsors, Psycorp. They were here today. And also Superhero. Superhero I first met at the Kapow Intergalactic Film Festival, which I co-organize. He had a documentary about him called Portrait of a Superhero. It's a short film. I'm sure you could find it someplace, probably on YouTube. Just a great guy. Also, if you happen to get a kick out of Andy Kaufman, please check out Andy Kaufman Lives. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Andy Kaufman is Alive. That's the 4-song EP. I like to call it a mini album. That is available on Bandcamp, Reverb Nation, Spotify, all of the streaming music channels. Thank you so much for listening to Inspirado Projecto, and we have lots more intriguing guests coming up. Please make sure to share this with your friends. Take care. Keep the Inspirado flowing.